The morning air inside Buckingham Palace was thick with the scent of aged velvet and furniture polish, a smell that had lingered in the royal corridors for centuries. In a quiet, seldom-used dressing room adjacent to the Queen's private apartments, two royal dressers moved with practiced efficiency. They were preparing for the final fitting of the robe of state, the crimson velvet masterpiece that Camilla, the queen consort, would wear in just a few short days for the coronation of her husband, King Charles III. The room was a chaotic symphony of garment bags, hat boxes, and gleaming shoe lasts. But the centerpiece, laid reverently across a long, linen-draped table, was the robe. It was a breathtaking waterfall of deepest crimson, its train long enough to require its own wheeled cart for transport. The dressers, women named Margaret and Anne, who had served the royal household for decades, spoke in hushed, reverent tones as they worked. They checked the pristine condition of the antique ermine trim, their fingers gently stroking the small, black-dotted tails. "We need to be absolutely sure of the fall," Margaret murmured, her voice a soft, Scottish lilt. "The train must cascade perfectly from the shoulders. There is no room for error on the day." Anne nodded, carefully adjusting the heavy velvet on the table to examine the golden embroidery that shimmered along the border. "It's remarkable, isn't it? To think this very robe was packed away for 70 years. It feels like we are touching history itself." Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the dressing room swung open with a force that made both women jump. A young, red-faced footman stood in the doorway, his brass-buttoned tunic rising and falling rapidly as he caught his breath. "Mr. Bates needs the Queen's coronation robe," he blurted out, his voice cracking slightly. The measurements from the original pattern. He says the alterations for the fit can't be finalized without cross-referencing the original 1953 cutting sheets. They're kept in the document safe in the Queen's wardrobe archives." Margaret frowned, a deep line etching itself between her brows. "The archives are through the Queen's secondary closet. That room is locked. We don't have the key." The footman shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Mr. Bates is with the King's tailor now. He said it's urgent. He said to use the master key. The archives must be opened." A heavy silence fell over the room. The master key was a legend, a heavy iron skeleton key kept in a locked box in the senior dresser's office. It could open any door in the private quarters, a relic from a time before electronic fobs and security codes. Using it felt like a breach of sacred trust. "Her Majesty is resting," Anne whispered, as if the walls themselves could hear. "We cannot disturb her for this." Margaret straightened her spine, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. "Then we have no choice. The coronation is paramount. Fetch the key, Anne." With the key in hand, the three of them, Margaret, Anne, and the nervous footman, walked the short distance to a discreet, paneled door at the end of the hall. It was painted the same cream color as the walls, nearly invisible. This was the entrance to the Queen's private closet, a space so personal that even senior staff rarely entered. It was a repository not just of clothes, but of memories. Margaret turned the heavy key in the lock. The mechanism clicked with a solid, definitive thud. She pushed the door open. The room inside was dim and cool, lit only by a sliver of pale London sunlight creeping through a gap in the velvet curtains. It smelled of lavender and cedarwood, a scent used to protect fine fabrics from moths. Racks of silk blouses and tailored suits stood in silent rows. Hat boxes, stacked to the ceiling, bore handwritten labels in a delicate script. Ascot 1977, Balmoral, September. This was a museum of a life of duty and public service. They moved through the main closet quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick Aubusson carpet. At the back, another, smaller door led to the archives, a temperature-controlled room filled with flat files and glass-fronted cabinets. But as they passed a particularly large, floor-to-ceiling wardrobe of dark, polished walnut, the footman stumbled on the edge of the carpet. He reached out a hand to steady himself, his palm pressing flat against the wardrobe door. The latch, old and worn, gave way with a soft click. The door swung silently open on well-oiled hinges. The footman froze. Margaret and Anne stopped and turned. The wardrobe was not meant to be opened. It was, in the unofficial hierarchy of the Queen's belongings, a space that held items no longer in use, items from the previous era. Inside, shrouded in a protective layer of acid-free tissue paper and translucent muslin, hung a single garment. Even under its wrappings, it had a presence. It loomed in the darkness of the wardrobe, a ghost of grandeur. "Oh, my goodness," Anne breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Margaret stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she gently pulled back the muslin shroud. The light from the archive room spilled into the wardrobe, and the fabric seemed to ignite. It was a heavy, sumptuous silk velvet, not crimson, but a deep, imperial purple so rich it seemed to absorb the light around it. It was embroidered with a breathtaking array of gold thread, forming intricate patterns of wheat ears and olive branches. The gold glittered and danced, a river of molten metal against the purple. The train was immense, folded carefully upon itself, but its scale was unmistakable. This was not Camilla's crimson robe. This was something else entirely. This was the robe of estate, worn by Queen Elizabeth II at her own coronation in 1953. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were staring at a piece of history that had been, for all intents and purposes, lost to time. The robe Queen Elizabeth had worn as she processed out of Westminster Abbey, the symbol of her new reign, had been hanging here in a closet for 70 years. It had been preserved, yes, but forgotten. It was the robe that had followed the young queen as she climbed into the gold state coach, the robe that had trailed behind her as she waved to the crowds from the Buckingham Palace balcony. It was a tangible link to a bygone age of post-war hope and a new Elizabethan era. It's the robe," the footman stammered, his earlier urgency forgotten. "I read about it. They had to source the silk from a special farm in Kent because of the rationing after the war. It took 12 women 3,000 hours to embroider." Margaret's mind was racing. This discovery was monumental, but it was also a complication of unimaginable proportions. The plan was set. Camilla was to wear the crimson robe of state, the arrival robe that had belonged to the late queen. Her own new purple robe of estate was being finished by the Royal School of Needlework. But this was the original. This was the one Elizabeth had worn. It was a relic. They stood in stunned silence, the weight of history pressing down upon them. They had come looking for a pattern, but they had found a legacy. The forgotten robe was a silent witness, a reminder that in the long story of the monarchy, they were all just temporary custodians. The door to the closet had been forcibly opened, and it had revealed a secret that would now have to be shared. The question was no longer about measurements. The question was what to do with the ghost in the wardrobe.